Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Health, Environment, Civil Rights, and Engagement Committee for October 28th, 2019. My name is Philippe Cunningham, and I am the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are Council Members Cano, Schrader, and Council Member Johnson. Council Vice President Jenkins will be joining us shortly. Colleagues, on our agenda today, we have 7 consent items and 2 discussion items. We will go ahead and approve of the consent agenda and then move into our discussion. So our first under the consent is item number 1 is approving 2 council appointments to the Violence Prevention Steering Committee. Item number 2 is authorizing a memorandum of understanding with the Natural Resources Defense Council for technical assistance and consulting services provided by the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge through next year, end of next year. Item number 3 is a gift acceptance from the U.S. Department of State for staff travel and lodging expenses for the Professional Fellows on Demand program. Item number 4 is accepting a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice in the amount of $894,346 to provide financial and technical assistance to plan, develop, and implement comprehensive efforts to identify, respond to, treat, and support those impacted by the opioid epidemic. Item number 5 is a gift acceptance from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School for Public Health for staff travel and lodging for the Bloomberg American Summit. Item number 6 is setting a public hearing for November 18th, 2019 to consider an ordinance amending Title 10, Chapter 204 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances related to food code, environmental preservation, environmentally acceptable packaging, amending regulations to provide a recycling and/or organics management system at public events and markets, and exempting some food establishments from the requirement to provide front-of-house recycling and/or organics collection. And item number 7 is setting a public hearing for November 18th, 2019 to consider an ordinance amending Title 15 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances relating to offenses, miscellaneous, adding prohibition of conversion therapy to prohibit conversion therapy or reparative therapy. We also, under that ordinance, there's 3 actually. The second component of it is amending the general provisions, administrative enforcement and hearing process, amending provisions related to personnel authorized to issue citations, and lastly, amending the definitions related to gender identity and sexual orientation to coincide with Chapter 402 prohibiting conversion therapy. Do my colleagues have any questions or comments on any of those items? All right, seeing none, first I'll welcome Councilmember Gordon. Seeing no questions or comments from my colleagues, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and those items carry. Next up, we have 2 discussion items. The first is going to be receiving and filing the Contract Compliance Division 2018 Annual Report, followed by receiving and filing an update related to the public safety goal area of the city's Strategic and Racial Equity Action Plan. So we'll go ahead and get started with our Contract Compliance Division Annual Report. And Sean, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One moment while I pull up the report, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, my name is Sean Skibby. I'm the director of the Contract Compliance Division, part of the Minneapolis Department of Civil Rights. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. During this presentation, I will provide a summary of the measurable outcomes related to each of the programs that the Contract Compliance Division oversees. There are 5 program areas administered by Contract Compliance, and they're detailed on page 3 of the report. Just a brief summary on that page. They're the Small and Underutilized Business Program, which focuses on business inclusion on city contracts, the city's Workforce Program, which helps provide employment opportunities to women and people of color on city contracts, the city's Affirmative Action Plan requirement, which requires contractors doing business with the city on contracts over $100,000 to have an approved Affirmative Action Plan on file with the division. The HUD Section 3 program, which is, of course, a Department of Housing and Urban Development program that is designed to provide opportunities to low-income people on projects that receive federal HUD funding. And the city's prevailing wage ordinance, which ensures that workers on city construction projects are paid appropriate prevailing wages in the construction program, which is essentially a series of programs administered, or a series of laws administered by several regional and governments, as well as the federal government. Within those 5, most of my presentation today is about the city's Small and Underutilized Business Inclusion Program, along with the Workforce Inclusion Program. I picked these 2 to emphasize because really this is the work that probably dominates most of what the division does. I also think that these programs really get to the crux of ensuring that the city is providing equitable opportunities to people of color, Indigenous people, and women, and doing its part to redress the historic disparity that has existed in the construction industry specifically, and the city as a whole for much, if not all of its history. So with that, I'll go to the next slide, and I don't want to go too far. I also want to note just a formatting change that we decided to implement this year and hopefully moving forward. So we changed the acronym of for businesses owned by women and people owned by people of color and Indigenous people. We changed that from Minority Business Enterprise to POCI, which stands for Person of Color and Indigenous, and we did this just to acknowledge the oppressive nature of the term minority. So wanted to make a note of that as well. You'll see that acronym for the first time, and just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. So starting with business inclusion and the Small and Underutilized Business Program, this is some data on the work we did over 2018. We reviewed 200 projects or contracts for SUBP goals. And so when we're looking at these, we're basically reviewing the work under the contract to see whether it's possible whether there are firms available where we can set a goal for businesses owned by women or people of color that bidders must either meet or make a good faith effort to meet before awarding the contract. So we reviewed 200 in 2018, and on page 4 of the report, we break that down a little farther. So of those 200, there were 101 construction and development projects, 69 professional, technical, and services projects, and then 30 goals requests on commodities contracts. In total, we set goals on 111 of these 200, and both of those are actually record highs for the division since we started tracking this data in 2015. So it was a busy year for us, a lot of volume, a lot of contract dollars, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that when we have firms available, we're putting a goal on those projects to make sure contractors are reaching out and doing their part to utilize SUBP firms. Moving on to the second section of that slide, we conducted 72 pre-award reviews in 2018. So this is the pre-award review process. Essentially means that it's a contract compliance will review these contracts before they're approved for contract award. So before they even go to council for you to review, we are looking at whether the bidders that have bid on these projects have met the contract goals. If they haven't met the contract goals, we're looking at whether they demonstrated good faith efforts which is a term of art under the ordinance that sort of outlines the steps the contractors have to take in order to try and meet that goal.
Mr. Skibby, I'm actually going to pause you right there. I have a
Sure.
question or a comment from Councilmember Gordon.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's more slides coming up, but you mentioned that there were only goals set on about 111, I think, out of the 200 that you reviewed. And I noticed in the report about the commodities and supplier contracts, out of 30, only 2 actually set goals. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how, why more of the contracts aren't required, or we're not expecting them to set goals.
Sure. Councilmember Gordon, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. So the commodities and supplies contracts have notoriously been challenging to set goals on. When we're looking at a contract, we're looking at subcontracting opportunities. We're looking for firms that do that work, and traditionally with commodities and supplies contracts, there aren't a lot of either of those, right? So subcontracting opportunities when you're purchasing equipment for, it might be a number of vehicles for the police department, for example, or it might be some materials for maintenance of a city building. There is traditionally not a lot of subcontracting that's part of that supply chain. There are also traditionally not a lot of local firms that are owned by women or people of color that provide that service. And so it's gotten very difficult. We might have set goals in 2017 on a couple of those commodities and supplies contracts. Before that, I don't think we ever did. So the 2, as low as it looks, I think actually constitutes an increase over what we've done in the past. I'd be happy to get you some of that historical information if that would be helpful. But that's sort of a summary of why that number looks the way it does.
No, but I appreciate that explanation. And the number in terms of construction and development projects is much higher. I think 85 out of 100 or so set goals. And I think that shows that we've been thinking about and working on construction and development a lot longer. And we've been looking at how we can help people start businesses and get interested in that field a lot longer. And so I think it shows that with some focus, maybe we can make progress in some of the other areas, but obviously it takes a bigger community to have more businesses who can provide those kind of supplies and services. So appreciate that.
Thank you, Councilmember, Mr. Chair. So getting back to the 72 pre-award reviews we conducted, just to give a breakdown of that, of those 72 reviews, 44 of those contractors committed to meeting the goals at the time or prior to contract award. At the time of the pre-award review, 28 sought award by demonstrating good faith efforts, and of those 28, the division approved 22 of them. We actually rejected 6 bidders for not meeting the goal or demonstrating SUBP, at which point the city did not enter into a contract with those firms. And then moving on to the last section, the last bullet point in the slide, we certified 28 firms as eligible for the SUBP program. That actually is also a record for 2018 for the number of firms we've certified. I expect us to beat that in 2019. But we, in addition to certifying those firms, we actually chaired the Certification Application Committee in 2018, and that's the committee that reviews and processes and makes decisions on all applications for SUBP certification when firms apply. So that was a big part of our work in 2018 as well. So continuing with the business inclusion components of our work. So in 28, if you look at the breakdown, this is a breakdown of a 4-year summary of construction projects. In 2018, we had 58 construction projects that we closed, totaling over $200 million. I think $221 million is the estimated amounts. This is actually detailed further on page 5 of the report as well. And these numbers actually show, as you can see, a pretty big jump in SUBP participation, both for businesses owned by women and businesses owned by people of color. The 10% of the dollars on these projects went to businesses owned by women and businesses owned by people of color, so that constitutes a significant increase over the previous years, as well as certainly over the year before that. Significant progress in that area. Over $20 million actually went to both of those firms in both of those groups. So a big step in the right direction as well that we'll hope to keep moving forward on in 2019. And again, one of the things that also might jump out to you if you look at the report on page 5 is that we closed more contracts in 2018 for a higher dollar amount than we have in the last 4 years. And again, with more money going to SUBP firms overall during the year. So good results overall on that, good progress, and we'll hope to keep that moving forward.
Mr. Skibby, I actually have a question. How do you gather data for women of color, and how is that disaggregated?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a popular question, actually, with firms that are trying to comply with SUBP as well. So we count firms that are owned by women, female people of color, and the people of color, and in the people of color category. So that's where they are counted. They do not count towards WBE. That is when we say WBE, that is a non-minority woman business enterprise designation. And so we do that because that's how we separate the goals. That's how we count their participation on a project.
So when you say non-minority, I'm assuming you mean white?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So is it possible for us to actually disaggregate? I think it's important for us to disaggregate and name the women of color, because if we're pulling out that data, particularly for white women, I think it's important for us to know how women of color are doing as well in comparison to the overall picture. So I just want to name that for consideration, because there's different experiences and access to business ownership, and so I just think that that would be something that's worth considering for how we present the data and how we talk about it.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you like us to follow up on that?
I would like that.
Okay.
I'm just thinking also as well in how we report out the data so that we are telling as comprehensive of a story of who is benefiting and how much they're benefiting.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about workforce inclusion. This applies to essentially the workforce inclusion on the city's construction projects. This is a representation of hours that were reported on hours that were reported on city construction projects that were subject to the prevailing wage requirement. So these are really a detailed breakdown of the construction trades, just to give a little bit more information about this, and there's more detail on page 6. Effective as of October 1st, 2017, the city modified its workforce inclusion goals to provide that 32% of all labor hours on city contracts are performed by people of color, and 20% of all hours are performed by women. These goals reflect the construction workforce goals established in 2017. I think in July of that year for Hennepin and Ramsey counties, those numbers were set by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. These numbers, as you can see in 2017, they do show a slight percentage decrease from 24 to 23% for hours worked by people of color. There was a total increase in the hours worked in that year, and the numbers correlate with around the same range as they have in previous years. The percentage of hours worked by women also increased 2% from 2017 from 4 to 6%, with the number of hours worked by women also increasing. So total number of hours have increased, and the percentages are reflected in that graph on the screen as well. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there are 5 program areas that contract compliance monitors. In addition to business and workforce inclusion, I've included some details on the other 3 as well. So in 2018, the division reviewed and approved 202 affirmative action plans. We closed 6 Section 3 covered projects with a total of 8% going to Section 3 businesses. And we recovered $19,423 in prevailing wage restitution for workers on city construction projects. And that's strictly for prevailing wage. So just to clarify, that's different than minimum wage or sick and safe time. This is for projects that were subject to prevailing wage. And then the last thing I want to mention is that the Contract Compliance Division Tableau data portal does report this information in real time on projects that we've closed. So you can see there's basically a hover function over any project that's in the portal where you can review the business inclusion and workforce inclusion participation numbers on any particular city project. If you're interested in one that's in your ward, or if you get a question from a constituent, or want to see how a contractor is performing or a department, you can go in there and break the data down by those categories as well. And with that, that concludes my presentation of the 2018 Annual Contract Compliance Division Report. I would like to thank the council for the continued support of the division. As you can see from the reported numbers, there's been an increase in both the contracts and the total contract dollars the division monitors. We're also working to certify more firms. This is done largely as a reflection of the market for construction, which is very high right now, and as well as some feedback we've heard from council members about the desire to reach out to more firms and try and certify more firms as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to present the report. I'm happy to field any questions you may have at this time.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions from my colleagues? All right, seeing none, I do have one question around the goals. If you can go back to that slide, it was the last goals that there we go. So for the workforce inclusion, I'm just curious as to what plan there is to be able to achieve those goals in the workforce inclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. One of the things I've done is I reached out to Mark Brenda, who is he works in CPED, and I had his title right here, and I'm going to pull it up momentarily here. He's the Director of Training and Employment at CPED. So he talked about some outreach being done at the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, where they are working with the unions on a program called Building Strong Communities. So 9 of the 25 construction trades are participating in that, and that's a program really to create pre-employment, pre-apprenticeship training for residents in that neighborhood to offer them more opportunities. I'd also be remiss to mention we're working with, currently exploring the possibility of partnering with St. Paul, the Department of Human Rights, MnDOT, and potentially other government agencies in the region and in the state to offer more comprehensive oversight of contractors working on government projects. And we think that offers some optimism and promise as well. And really, hopefully, again, when we're talking about these numbers, these are goals set by the Department of Human Rights. They're adopted by Minneapolis. We want to reflect that as both a city value and what we think needs to happen, frankly, for the construction trades to fill the gap of people that are retiring and are stepping out of this work. And so we see those goals as both a value and a need for the industry. And we want to make sure we're moving towards that as well. We think that'll make a difference.
Great, thank you. All right, seeing no questions or comments, thank you very much for this presentation with your annual report. And I would like to make a motion to receive and file the Contract Compliance Division 2018 Annual Report. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and that item carries. Thank you again so much
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
to not only Mr. Skibby, but also Director Hrobel as well for your leadership. Our last item on today's agenda is receiving and filing an update related to the public safety goal area of the city's strategic and racial equity action plan. So folks know, for the public record, we have, within this committee, we have violence prevention that is reported to this committee due to the public health approach within violence prevention, as well as youth development. And this particular goal that was established and passed by the city council and supported by the mayor has a very heavy youth development aspect to it, focus on it. So we will be having a presentation here, as well as having a different angle of a presentation with the Public Safety and Emergency Management Committee, chaired by Councilmember Cano. So Commissioner Musicanth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. So this is an opportunity for us to dig a little deeper than you've had a chance to hear about this particular strategic priority. I know you had an overview and you adopted some of the foundational work. So I'd like to thank both Josh Peterson and others in our Office of Violence Prevention and also the Youth Coordinating Board staff for helping us pull together the materials today. Just as a reminder, back in August and September of 2018, the SREAP strategies process planning retreats happened. And in February, there were some initial priorities that were drafted by council, and then that set in motion subject matter expert groups that were created. And so one of those was created around the strategic priority of public safety. And then in July of this year, the strategic need and policy statements were adopted by council. In the, I haven't moved on yet. In the policy priority drafting, both the police department and the health department were designated as co-owners of the process. So the chief and I are process owners for the public safety priority. And the original direction that was given to us was to eliminate the disproportionate impact of violence in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And so those work groups were comprised of community representatives, subject matter experts, city staff from health and police and other departments, and the Division of Race and Equity. And the group was asked to outline the strategic need, key lagging indicators, problem statement, goals, metrics of urgency, and a few vital projects associated with that. So the context for the discussions that occurred was that we have a significant population of young people living in high violence areas in Minneapolis, and we'll show you a map in a slide or two. We also know that youth development programs can reduce involvement with violence. There's literature to show that. And we know that funding for youth development programs continues to decline. This is a true statement, but one that's hard for us to quantify because most of that funding does not flow through the fingers of the city. It's philanthropy, it's the federal government, it's the state government, and the funding is going to agencies within the city of Minneapolis, but cumulatively there's a tremendous impact, and I will try and show that to you. As the group met, it was really challenging for us to take a complex idea like violence and kind of boil it down in this process of finding one thing to do. And so I think the final result can't be regarded as the only strategy. It is one strategy, and that hopefully working on that strategy will help us to learn and develop approaches to many of the other strategies which we are also working on at the same time related to violence prevention. And so the group concluded that focusing upstream on young people provides an opportunity for more powerful and more lasting change, and that's why that priority was chosen. So the context you'll see in these two maps, the map on the left highlights the significant overlap between parts of the city with high concentrations of young people and high concentrations of violent crime. The dark colored textured boxes show where there is an overlap between those two. And then the map on the right shows neighborhoods with high concentrations of people of color. And so from the two, we can infer that young people of color are particularly at risk for experiencing the burden of violence. So let me talk a little bit more about why youth development and public safety are related. So peer review research supports the idea that the presence of protective factors can lead to substantial reductions in involvement in violence, even for young people who have significant risk factors for involvement in violence presence. Locally, the Wilder Foundation has shown some social return on investment, with mentoring programs returning almost $3 for every dollar invested. And also, youth intervention programs have shown a return on investment of almost $5 for every dollar invested. So this somewhat elusive context of funding, we tried to lay it out here for you. As far back as 2002 to 2003, we saw the state decrease its funding in youth development by almost $11.5 million. Of that, $3 to $4 million came directly to organizations within the city of Minneapolis. And for a number of years after that, there was no funding. Then in 2008, 2009, there was a little bump, but that funding has gone away. So since 2009, none of that source of funding has been available in the state, and of course not to Minneapolis. So in the area of major local private grants for after school, two main after-school providers in the state gave out in 2009 about $16 million. In the same organizations in 2018 gave out $4 million. And these grants come predominantly from the McKnight Foundation, Youth Prize, and United Way. The majority of their grants are in the metro area, and Minneapolis is very significantly represented. Minneapolis organizations are very significantly represented in the grant giving. Thirdly, the federal 21st Century Community Learning Center grants. In 2019, no Minneapolis-based programs were awarded. We believe that this represents about a $2 million additional loss of funding. So I don't know if you can visualize youth programming, but you get a lot of bang for your buck, shall we say. And so that massive disinvestment in youth programming over the years has brought us to where we are today with the challenges that we have in our community. On top of that, the city of Minneapolis itself has had something called the WhyMath Program. Back in 1993, $1 million was invested in programming that goes through the community ed in the schools and the parks and the libraries. Over time, for a variety of reasons and budget pressures, that has decreased and is now $300,000.
Commissioner, I have actually have a question. If you could go back one slide. For the 1993, the $1 million, is that, are those in real dollars or is that $1 million that was allocated in 1993 and not adjusted for what $1 million would mean today?
Mr. Chair, yeah, it'd be great if we had adjusted it for inflation, but no, it's actual dollars.
Okay, I think we should just consider like letting folks know like this is what it translates to now if we had that much money. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So to return to the SREAP process, the strategic need and the policy statements that were adopted by City Council are on the slide. I'm going to read them just because. So the strategic need that was approved by City Council in July was to increase the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color ages 10 through 24 years living in higher violence areas of Minneapolis who participate in high-quality youth development programs. And so the policy statement, which is really the background, sort of restates some of the things that I've told you. High-quality youth development programs offer protective social opportunities for young people at risk of involvement with violence. Since 2003, funding for youth programs has been diminishing across Minnesota. The city is responsible for public safety of all residents, including social and community protections. An absence of quality, sustainable, and culturally responsive programming may contribute to an over-reliance on enforcement as the primary method of ensuring public safety. Youth development programs that provide key protective factors that buffer against violence must be a part of the city's public safety approach. So that was voted on and approved by the City Council this summer. And so it is based on that direction that we are trying to make some progress. So this slide, I'm going to focus more on the right-hand side of this slide. So we were asked as part of this process to create metrics of urgency. And so the metrics of urgency identified were two. One is that we would measure, or hope to measure, the number and percent of high-quality, culturally responsive youth development programs that serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color ages 10 through 24 in higher violence areas in Minneapolis. The second metric of urgency would be that the number and percent of Black, Indigenous, and people of color participants in each high-quality, culturally responsive youth development program. And so this would then lead us in the direction of that goal, a decrease in the number of youth of color ages 10 through 24 living in high violence areas who are reported as victims or perpetrators of violence. And so then in the process, this leads us to a vital few projects, and really there are again two. One is to establish a permanent, stable source of funds for supporting establishment, maintenance, and delivery of high-quality, culturally responsive youth development programs. And two, to implement a system of monitoring and reporting the existence of and participation in programs in Minneapolis by neighborhood. I actually would have reversed the order of those last two because we're not really deeply capable of measuring what is going on, and I think that might be one of our first steps. So, potential next steps, and I'm thinking these are things that we can bring back to you early next year for ratification in some cases, like definitions. Agree upon a definition of high violence areas in Minneapolis so that we're always measuring the same thing. Agree on definitions of high quality and culturally responsive youth development. And then the projects that we need to be working on is establishing a permanent, stable source of funds for these programs and implementing a system to monitor and report them. And so really, I think the next step then is for us to gather additional input from all of you and set the stage for thinking about how to move forward in these processes. So just to dig a little deeper into those last items that I just talked about, in terms of the definition of high violence area, we're using some of it to make the maps that I showed you today. And so building on that, we can continue to work with our Health Department Research and Evaluation Division within our department, and then working with the Police Department and the Violence Prevention Steering Committee, finalize the definition and bring that back for your consideration. Also, in identifying a definition for high-quality, culturally responsive youth development, there is an existing definition used by Ignite After School. And so working with that definition to make sure that it fits here in Minneapolis, in consultation with the Youth Coordinating Board and the Youth Congress, we can bring that back again for you to discern and approve or modify.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Are we collaborating at all with the University of Minnesota's Youth Development Leadership Program? Because they have some really phenomenal researchers and experts in this area. So I was just curious if there's been any sort of cross-sector collaboration in that way.
I'll turn my attention to see if Josh can tell me Mr. Chair, it doesn't appear that I have a good answer for you, but we can get back to you on that, and if we aren't, we will work on that.
And I was in that program at one point, so I'm happy to make connections as necessary as well. So, awesome.
Thank you. All right, the next slide is talking about that permanent, stable source of funding. And I think, yes. And so we're not starting from scratch here. In the 2040 plan that was just adopted, there's a statement there's a section addressing the importance of equitable access to youth programming. So we've already, as a city, acknowledged in other ways the importance of this. Our city legislative agenda has language in it that also, I believe, speaks to the need for this at the state level, such a program to exist. And of course, we have that ongoing WhyMath money that we are already allocating and have a history of allocating. And we have some cross-enterprise, cross-jurisdictional bodies that can help us continue to work on this. We host something called the Youth Cabinet, which I'm a co-chair of, that is representatives from various departments within the city talking about youth. And then, of course, we are an active member of the Youth Coordinating Board, which is similar interests as this particular strategic priority. So, on to implementing a system for counting, monitoring, and reporting the existence of and participation in youth development programs in Minneapolis. We have some possibilities. The Youth Coordinating Board has something called a 612 Program Finder. This is a voluntary program, so programs voluntary sign up to have their information shared there. And it is being refreshed. And so that we think once that website is refreshed, individuals go there to find out about programming, but we can also find out from the programs what kind of participation they're getting in their programs. So we think that is a foundation upon which we can lean for some of the data we're looking for. And then if a youth fund of some size were developed, that could certainly be something we could put as mandatory data collection from a youth fund, so we could collect further information. So, I hope this has been somewhat helpful to see the background that we're working with, but also to see what a long journey we have to accomplishing some progress in this area. Some of it is process progress, so we can get definitions and start measuring. Some of it is going to be a little heavier lift as we think about what kind of partnerships we can create or where we can begin to reverse this declining trend of support for youth programming.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. Do I have any questions or comments? Councilmember Cano.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question on the rationale for that drastic cut in funding. Well, actually, in state funding, it wouldn't be a cut. It would be the total obliteration of youth funding. What's the rationale that was that you're aware of that was surrounding those series of decisions and pattern to not invest or disinvest in youth altogether?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Cano, 2003, I placed that in the Pawlenty administration, and I believe that there were a lot of financial challenges that the state was facing, and this was a casualty of that. I don't recall exactly how we got that one-year bump or why that went away. We can try and find that out.
Mr. Crute, do you have the answer or any additional specifics on that, since I know you've done a lot of lobbying at the state around this? If you could come to the speaker podium and give us a little bit more details, please.
Certainly, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. The first obliteration, which is an excellent term, was an unallotment by Governor Pawlenty's office. There was 1 year in which they were able to get 1 year of funding, and then it did not get continued. Ignite After School, which I serve on the board of, has tried now for about 5 years to get some additional state funding, and because of the political situation, we haven't been able to do that. So usually one body says no. So it's just not something that people have been willing to do. So Commissioner Muscat was right. it's a political decision.
I wonder, could you provide a little bit more information in the most recent set of administrations, the most recent administration under Governor Dayton, what were the conversations with his office like at the time? Because if we're talking about since 2009, that's 10 years of no funding. We certainly have seen leadership change in the state legislature. So just curious what the maybe most recent 4 or 5 years have entailed.
Council member, the governor's office was supportive of additional funding, but his focus was on early childhood funding, and that's where he spent most of his time when it came to children and young people. And so it was not a high priority of his administration, really, to work on after-school funding. Although I can tell you that Lieutenant Governor Smith was very supportive. I had met with her a number of times. She, by the way, is the co-chair of the U.S. Senate caucus on after-school. So she was very supportive and very excited and willing to work on it, but it did not come to the top of the governor's agenda. And also, usually one of the bodies, the House or the Senate, was also not willing to take it up. So there were a number of years when we couldn't even get a hearing in the last 10 years.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit to a different question, Commissioner. So I want to be careful that what we're not saying, and I don't think this is what you're saying, but just want to make it clear to the public that youth equals violence, and so young people equals violence. But I'm curious as to whether there's been any data that shows a correlation between the disinvestment of opportunities for young people and increase in any particular type of violent acts, whether it's more use of guns or other. I'm just trying to kind of connect the dots here in a mindful way while not condemning a whole population of folks.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Cano. I think the research that's been done has been looking at the impact on young people. We know that, and I think the ages up to age 24 is really important because we know that brain development is still in process up to age 24 in terms of setting the brain being ready to see long-term consequences and so on. And so there's been a lot of research and curiosity around adolescence, and a clear and persistent finding that not only are young people at risk because of some of their life circumstances, but there are resilient factors that can balance that out. And so that, in that context, has been how they have looked at this youth development impact on violence. I would imagine that it has even longer term payoff beyond violence within adolescence and young adulthood, because we know that certain patterns that are created continue longer in life. I think it's an opportunity to see results sooner by looking at young people in with an investment like this. But I don't think it's a particular type of violence within that age group. It's just a combination of brain development and a rapid return on investment.
Thank you. And then my last comment is a comment, and I just wanted to let my colleagues know that Councilmember Fletcher and I did have a in-depth conversation with some of the downtown youth support providers to talk about the young folks who are coming to the downtown community between 9 or 10 p.m. up until 2 or 3 in the morning, and really figuring out what kinds of wraparound support systems and strategies we can implement to really help those young people connect to a mentor, an adult that can be their navigator, their coach, their source of support. As we're looking at issues of crime and safety in the downtown area. And some of the conversations relate to how the downtown physical buildings where these services are offered, such as the Juvenile Supervision Center, are very anti-youth in their space and presentation. And so just thinking about how we connect the dots on lack of funding, but seeing that the city of Minneapolis is building a new building here in the downtown area where the future home of that Juvenile Supervision Center will be, and how I invite you and ask for your support in making sure that physical infrastructure reflects a more youth-oriented building and environment and space where we can have different signage, where it can have different colors, where it can have a more accessible entry. Here, where it is now, you have to have a certain key and it can only be open during a certain amount of hours during the day. So it's not very obvious that there's a place here for young people. So just thinking to the future and understanding that the city does have a lot of money on the table to build this new building, we can have a direct impact on that now. So I just wanted to flag that for my colleagues and ask for your support in figuring out how we can make that a more suitable location for young people.
Thank you. I just actually want to get some clarification around the Juvenile Supervision Center. Is that a walk-in space, or is that when young people are apprehended by cops, by police officers, and then are brought into this space? Or is it a walk-in center?
Mr. Chair, it is at this time. You are referred there or brought there by the police.
Okay. And the reason why I want to clarify that is because we actually don't have any walk-in youth development centers downtown. So that's something for us to take into consideration. I think long-term is there's that component that there is not actually walk-in youth-oriented spaces downtown, but also I can say in my ward, for example, that I have one youth serving organization in my entire ward, and I have a large swath of land in my ward. And it's a youth program, it's a youth music program, and it can only serve so many young folks. And that's the only, we have parks, and we don't even have like any arts programming, or like we have football and basketball. Like that's basically the long and short of what we have available in my community. And so if we were to have more youth-oriented programming from ages that ranges from 10 to 24, we might not see so many young folks coming downtown so that they have somewhere to go and something to do. And so I think that's why place-based investments are really important, and just thinking about the fact that we do have a gap. And I know that this has been a long conversation, like 20 years or so, about like there's no downtown center for young people, and who's responsible for addressing that. So like that's been a long time conversation. So there's a couple of things. First, I am very supportive of this goal in the perspective of, as a former youth worker, I understand, and I've done a ton of research and understand the positive impacts and implications for youth development programming, not only on helping young people develop into well-adjusted adults, but also the immediate impact of between 2 and 7 p.m., how we see crime go down in that time. And it's pretty logical. If they're not out on the streets, then they're not engaged in maladaptive behaviors. I think that this is a huge important gap that we need to address. I also just want to give a shout out to Ignite Minnesota, because that's how I cut my teeth on public policy. Was I got paired with Ann to go to the state and advocate for after school funding. I think that was the year we couldn't get a public hearing. So the politics were very challenging that year. And you know, I say this once, I say it a million times, when it comes to kids, it should be apolitical. And I am very frustrated that we continue to have this issue. So there's a couple of process questions that I have. The first is the fact that the health department is not the only process owner. The Minneapolis Police Department is as well. Can you tell me a little bit more about what role that they've played in this particular component? And I know this is going before the Public Safety Committee, so we can have a much deeper conversation, but I see that they're not here today, for example. What role have they played, and will they play with a youth development-oriented goal?
Mr. Chair, thank you for that question. They were active participants in the work group. The chief himself was there, and a number of his staff participated. As conversations developed, we wanted to recognize that some of these programs are not limited to what the city finances with that $300,000. Certainly our police athletic league and the relationships between the SROs and the bike cops and youth are all part of that big web of connectivity between adults and children. So we think that even though it isn't something that looks strictly public safety in orientation, that there is a role for the police in implementing this as well. Having said that, you are correct, they are not here. I have shared the PowerPoint with them and invited them, and hope that we will have some representation when we go to the Public Safety Committee.
Thank you for that. I want to make a suggestion to the various folks who are in charge of this, that maybe we should consider adding the Youth Coordinating Board as a process owner, given, again, this is a youth development oriented goal, and that is the organizing body across the city. So I think it would, and across jurisdictions, I think it might make sense. And then I have one more question, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues here who have some questions. So Councilmember Warsame and I have been working on a youth development fund. We've been having conversations with the Youth Coordinating Board, who's also been having conversations about a youth fund. And within the proposal that Councilmember Warsame and I worked on, it addresses actually both of the vital few projects that have been identified for this. This plan is supposed to be a strategic plan for 5 years. If we are fortunate and the mayor and the city council create a fund next year, then there will be 2 years of it will be rolling out, but there won't necessarily be active work and process change that's happening. I'm just curious about, because it's like we can just check the box and say, cool, we've done that, and so it feels kind of like a little bit more short term. How do you see this fitting into more of a long-term violence prevention strategy?
Mr. Chair, I think that would be a wonderful scenario if we could get that done really quickly. And if so, then I think, one, we will need to continue to measure it and see how successful it is, and if it's reaching the young people that we hope and need to be reaching according to this plan. And then I imagine, as with the other priorities, there may be things that get done more quickly than those 5 years, and so I'm sure that within the SREAP process, there's an opportunity to come back and revisit. As I said at the beginning, this is not a singular strategy by any means. We have a lot of strategies, and so to address violence overall, and so those will all continue, and I think that we have a steering committee that can help us evaluate the opportunities and the challenges as something like that would roll out, if it would roll out so quickly.
Fingers crossed. I think it's important. It's our top public safety goal, so I hope that all the electeds can get on board so we can work on that together. Councilmember Gordon.
Well, I really appreciate the report here, and I think there's lots of evidence out there that says that after school and youth development funding is worth the investment, and there's lots of research that goes way back to the 90s and even related to crime reduction in terms of being victims or youth who get involved with law enforcement. And there's lots of that out there from experts across the country who've looked at that. I think that, and I didn't really know that there's youth funding work going on, but I think that's something that this committee could perhaps hold on to and grab onto. I know that Baltimore, for example, has a youth fund where there's a certain percentage. I think it's a percentage, but some of their property tax general fund revenue just goes to a youth fund, and I think they have $12 million a year or something like that. I think it would be helpful maybe if the committee or the council in general had an awareness of what are the alternatives. What we're going to hear here is this should be a state problem, or the feds should fund this, or the county should take this on, or what about the parks and the schools? So we're going to have a lot of navigating to do here to say this should be a city, if we think it is, it should be a city responsibility in some way. What could we do to lead on it or get matches? And it might be interesting to learn a little bit more about what other cities have done or what ideas are being discussed right now. I certainly am supportive of the Youth Coordinating Board being involved. I know we I mean, I think it'll be important for them to meet as a group and say we want to be involved and make this a priority. It also might be a way to leverage our other jurisdictions to participate in it with us. I can tell you the Youth Coordinating Board has had presentations on the problem. We've looked at it, and we've even had presentations about a youth fund and what that might look like. And I think that's probably where I learned about Baltimore. But it's definitely a topic that I think our partners at the Park Board and the schools would be very interested in too. I think the parks and schools probably implement more youth programming than other entities in Minneapolis, so they would probably be interested in seeing what resources could help give them too. But I also, I understand if a couple council members are deep along a path towards something that might even come up as a budget amendment this year. Is that what I was hearing?
No.
Okay. Well,
No.
okay, too bad. It won't be as quick as you hoped, maybe.
Even the other timeline is a wonderful
I'm
thing.
in 2020, but
Okay.
If my colleagues on this committee would like, I'm happy to send the policy brief that has been done on this topic that includes a lot of research from also the policy brief that the Youth Coordinating Board has pulled together. Is that something folks would like?
Yeah.
More than happy to share that. Councilmember Cano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify that the conversation about how the future location of the Juvenile Supervision Center is wanting to be, the operators want it to be more of a drop-in opportunity. So right now, folks want to be able to tell people, hey, you should go to this place where you can kind of hang out there and wait until either an adult can come get you or until we connect you to other resources and programs. And they can't do that for a couple of the way that the accessibility into the building is built in with MBC. So they've made that request of the building manager, but it doesn't seem like the building is structured in a way where that can happen. So just thinking ahead, acknowledging that the Link and others, including MPD, have expressed the interest in making the new location of the Juvenile Supervision Center more accessible, more youth-oriented, to have a more welcoming sense of place. So just wanted to make that clarification that it's not that that's what it currently is, but that folks are hungry for that. That's been an identified solution, but the constraints of this current building prevent us, meaning all of the folks who are at the table, working on the Juvenile Supervision Center to allow that to happen.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments from my colleagues? All right. Thank you so much to everybody who has been involved with this process. It was a long and daunting process. Just another shout out of gratitude to my colleague, Council Vice President Jenkins, who led the process overall. I think that this work is incredibly important. Our city really is asking for us to invest in public safety strategies, and we have to be looking at the comprehensive approach to public safety. And so I'm really grateful that we're thinking innovatively around this and that we're looking upstream and being proactive rather than reactive. And so I think that this is really important work and a really big gap that we currently have in our governing infrastructure on that. Thank you, Commissioner. I would like to move approval of receiving and filing the update related to the public safety goal area of the city's strategic and racial equity action plan. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. The ayes have it, and that item carries. Seeing no further business before this committee, we are adjourned.